We're now going to turn to our second speaker, our first speaker for the opposition, Yasmine Ahmed. Yasmine Ahmed is a lawyer and activist and the UK director of Human Rights Watch. She's also served as the executive director of award-winning human rights organisation Rights and Security International. Yasmine, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me here this evening. Thank you to the first proposition speaker. I thought that was a wonderful start to the debate. So firstly, I want to make 4 contextual points which inform my position that Western intervention has not been a force for good. Firstly, my life has been fundamentally shaped by Western intervention. That is colonial intervention. The British and other colonial powers went on a quest to civilise the world, and in this context, they ruled over my father's family in British India for just under a century. Suffice to say that the ongoing trauma of violence inflicted against my family and other Indians during colonial rule and the devastating effect of the negligent withdrawal that left up to 1 million people dead and millions destitute is a trauma that is seared into my psyche and that of my family, as well as millions of Indians and Pakistanis today. Secondly, it is my job, day in, day out, as the UK Director of Human Rights Watch, to try and convince governments, mostly the UK government, given my role, to use foreign policy tools to push other governments to stop committing human rights harms and violations. Whether it's financial sanctions on governments linked to commercial entities in Myanmar, travel bans on Chinese officials, or the suspension of military assistance to Egypt, I believe it is essential that states don't sit by and watch human rights abuses and crimes being committed. So let's just be clear on that. However, I think this is a really important point in this debate because nothing in life I have found is black and white. There is always a cost and a consequence of any action that is taken, including at times, as we have seen, loss of life and severe human rights violations. This is certainly almost always true for interventions that involve military force. Whether the thousands of innocent civilians, including children, who died during the ISAF bombing in Afghanistan, and I pause here to remember a very startling fact, that between 2016 and 2020, 40% of all civilian casualties in Afghanistan were children, or those that were subject to torture and mistreatment by the UK or US forces in Iraq. But even for non-violent military measures, there are consequences that need to be considered. This was laid bare when Madeleine Albright, then US ambassador to the UN, publicly stated that the death of a reported 500,000 of Iraqi children who died as a result of the consequence of US sanctions on Iraq following the 1991 Gulf War was a price worth paying. It is important to remember not only that consequence, that those sanctions also had longer-term effects. They reinforced Saddam Hussein's power and weakened Iraqi society, which contributed to the collapse of Iraqi society after the Western invasion and Saddam's fall. Thirdly, of my contextual points, I am not arguing that all Western interventions have been destabilising and harmful, and nor do I need to. The contention is that Western intervention on the whole has been a force for good. And the evidence, I would say, is clear that it has not. Finally, when I speak about Western interventions, I will speak to military interventions. But as I note above, there is certainly strong evidence to suggest that even non-military interventions, including the use of blunt sanctions like we saw in Iraq and Iran, have not on the whole stabilised and lifted societies. And again, I say on the whole. Nearly everywhere that the West and Western powers have intervened militarily in the past 20 years, many times under the guise of counterterrorism, is worse off today than it was when the intervention began. From Iraq to Libya and Afghanistan to Somalia, societies are fractured, governance has been nearly wholly undermined, corruption is rife, violence is epidemic, with millions already dead and injured, women's rights have been annihilated, extrajudicial executions are often rife. And we see this case in Afghanistan, for example. As the previous speaker has mentioned, the situation of women's rights, we know that there's extrajudicial executions that my organisation have been routinely researching and reporting on. And we also know that nearly 19 million people in Afghanistan are experiencing high levels of food insecurity, with more than 34,000 children admitted to hospital with severe malnutrition, not 20 years ago, not 40 years ago, in 2022. It is likely that many other Afghan children did not reach hospital. Turning to Iraq, on a conservative estimate, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis have died as a result of the Iraq invasion, with millions more displaced. While it is true that one can say not all these outcomes are because of Western military intervention, and I agree with that, there cannot be an argument that the interventions have played a part in this. And what we can certainly say is that on the whole, Western interventions have not created better outcomes for those living in these countries and regions, but instead, in many, and I would say most situations, have left them in tatters. Now, I think it's important that we understand why this is the case. And I want to speak to 3 reasons. So firstly, I think the first reason, and an important reason, is that societies that are not our own, that are of another culture and another people, every society is complex. And it is proved time and time again that Western countries have failed to understand the very basic political and cultural dynamics of the country that they intervene in. This has had devastating consequences in Iraq, for example, where the West had little understanding of the sectarian politics in Iraq, which with de-Baathification has led to unprecedented violence and instability in Iraq and Syria. Secondly, and this to me is probably of my life lessons that I've learned in my career and my life more generally, is the key point. The approach of Western intervention has been one that has been seen primarily through the lens of violence. It is securitized and very short-term, and that fails to adequately grapple with and prioritise the underlying reasons and drivers of instability, or the vacuums that have led to people like Gaddafi and Saddam having power, and the factors, most importantly, that will lead to long-term stability, security, and prosperity. And what do I mean? Strong governance institutions, a vibrant and active civil society, access to education and healthcare, gender equality, and tackling corruption. In fact, many of these interventions have served to perpetuate corruption, exclusion and abuse, and unequal access to services, opportunities, and resources. And I will say that Afghanistan is a very good example of this. While it is certainly the case that 20 years of interventions did see progress in many areas, including governance, girls' education and participation in public life, as well as media freedom and a number of other things. However, Western states' propensity to prioritise short-term military gains over the creation of genuinely democratic institutions and the protection of human rights fatally undermined both ISAF's mission and the entire post-2001 state-building effort. As my colleague, the Human Rights Watch Afghan researcher, Patty Grossman, told me, over-reliance of airstrikes without adequate civilian protections, relying on abusive warlords to fill security vacuums, political leadership roles, and largely ignoring wholesale corruption, did foster and continues to foster deep resentment and distrust on the US and Afghan governments, grievously weakening Afghanistan's military and political capabilities and made it far easier for the Taliban to gain ground. Libya is another stark example of how Western countries fail to understand that military force without a plan for and an investment in the long-term stability of the country is nothing but disaster. We have seen in Libya the security vacuum that is left after the US-led intervention has been filled by legions of armed militia, foreign mercenary, Islamic extremists, human traffickers, regional and international powers, which has left the country in a state of instability and mayhem. And within that context, my organisation at Human Rights Watch and many others have documented long-term arbitrary detention, unlawful killings and enforced disappearances. I will ignore...
I'm receptive to a lot of the things you're saying, but it seems to be that you're making the case that our interventions should be for the long term. They should be better thought out, but you're not making a case against intervention in itself. So to put that in a concrete question to you, do you think that Afghanistan is better off now that we've left?
So I think the point is that we are looking at whether Western military intervention has done well and has been a force for good. And what we can see, and the only evidence I have of that, is where Afghanistan is now and where Afghanistan was before 2001. There were not thousands of children dying. There were not thousands of children starving. I do not say this is a perfect world. I do not say that this is black and white. I have myself personally grappled with this issue immensely over time. I worked as a legal advisor at the UK Foreign Office during Syria, during Libya and other things. And I can tell you it's something that's kept me up at night. But what I have seen is Western military intervention has been seen through one prism. And I think it's important to note those people that are the biggest proponents of Western military intervention, when you ask them, because they talk about values and they talk about stability and they talk about protecting people, women, children. But what do they do when those women and children arrive on our shores as refugees? They tell them that they should leave. They send them to Rwanda. This is not the sort of situation where we get to pick and choose. If we're genuinely about morality, it should be morality no matter where that arises. So I will leave you tonight, and I think this is a really important point to end on. I worked as a Foreign Office legal advisor, and I was always known in that role as the person who was very much about sticking to the legal provisions of the UN Charter when it provided for force, but even then, to be thinking about it in a much more holistic and complex way. And I think Libya is the perfect example of that. There were many in the legal advisors who I work with, who obviously I can't name, many senior people who disagreed with me. And it was hard. I was a junior legal advisor, but they disagreed with me. They said, no. You're not being realistic. You're not thinking about the situation on the ground. You don't care about these people. If you did, you would think differently. The law can't be so rigid. Life can't be so rigid. And then last year, I met up with one of my former colleagues. And as we were departing, we were just near Westminster. As we were departing, he said, Yasmine. I said, what? He said, I just want to say to you, and he was smiling, he said, you know what? You were right. Had the West not intervened in the way that it did post-2001, the world would be a very, very different place. And I say to you tonight that I understand and I appreciate the complexity of this situation. But what has been laid bare very, very clearly is that the Western interventions that we have seen to date have not, on the whole, led to security, stability, and prosperity. Thank you.